Hi, everybody. I'm Gary Machuda, and this is the Apocrypha Apocalypse, the channel on YouTube where we reveal the truth about the so-called Apocrypha, hence the apocalypse, the revealing of the Apocrypha. And we do this through investigation of primary sources. And this is part of a deep dive that we're doing into the writings of Flavius Josephus, specifically his words in Against Appian. And Against Appian, he is claimed to give us a canonical list of the Jewish books at the end of the first century. So, does this first century Jewish historian really give us a canon? Or is this the predominant view, the canonical interpretation? Is this really well founded? That's what we've been investigating. In this episode, we're going to finish up what we call canonical framing. So fasten your seatbelts, folks, because the Apocrypha Apocalypse begins right now. So, looking at the first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, in his work Against Appian, Book 1, sections 37 through 43, that is normally interpreted as Josephus, this first century Jew, giving us a canon list of the Old Testament books of his day. And this is by far the most predominant way to interpret these words. We'll call it the canonical interpretation. But does the canonical interpretation hold water? I don't believe so. And so this whole series is a slow process of us dismantling all the falsehoods and soft data and really sticking to Josephus to see what exactly is he giving us in Against Appian. Is he giving us a canonical list? And so far in this series, we've seen how the canonical interpretation actually begins way back with Eusebius in his church history, where he quotes Against Appian. And we noted that the text from Against Appian that he uses is defective. It has certain elements in it that's not authentic, but it makes Josephus sound as if he is distinguishing divine books from non-divine books. In other words, he's given us a canon. Now, whether Josephus added this element or it was part of his Greek text, we don't know, but all we know is that Josephus has it. And that canonical interpretation is picked up later through pre-critical Greek text of Against Appian, and especially in very, very popular English translation by William Whiston that was written back in the 1700s. It's public domain. It has the complete works of Josephus, incredibly cheap. The problem is it's not a great translation. And in Against Appian, he's using a bad text. And his text in William Whiston's translation frames Josephus as giving a canon. Now, I use the word frame here in the sense that maybe you've heard people say, I was framed. In other words, somebody set somebody up to make it appear that they did something they didn't do. Well, that's canonical framing. And I think this goes on not only on the popular level, but in the academia as well. And so we were looking at how scholars will frame Josephus in such a way that the average reader automatically approaches his text in Against Appian as if he's giving a canonical list of books, when in fact he's actually not. And we saw how the word canonical is inserted into Eusebius. So it sounds like Eusebius understood Josephus to be giving a canon when the word canonical is not there in the Greek text. We also saw, of course, William Whiston, that's a canonical framing in the English text. We also noted how, both on the popular level and academic level, people often describe Josephus as giving a canon. And that itself is canonical framing, because the term canon isn't used for the contents of the Bible. That's used hundreds of years after Josephus, and it's a distinctly Christian usage. The rabbis, the Jews, didn't talk about canon in that sense. Instead, they preferred to talk about the sacredness of writings and whether or not a writing defiles the hands, which of course Josephus never talks about defiling the hands. He doesn't really even emphasize the sacredness, although indirectly he does later on. And he does talk a little bit about inspiration. So all of that we're going to discuss later on. But just describing Josephus as giving a canon is itself anachronistic. Probably the biggest wow factor in terms of framing Josephus comes when scholars and popular people describe him as giving a canon list. And just go on Google, type in Josephus canon list. You'll see dozens of hits that will come up. Click on the subdivisions on the top for books. You'll see dozens of books that speak of Josephus's canon list. But when you look at Josephus, as we saw in the last episode, he doesn't give a list. So it's being described as a list, even though it's not. It's really an enumeration. He gives numbers and descriptions. But you see, if you believe he's giving a canon, then it's important for him to identify exactly which individual books are in and thereby which are out, right? So it stands to reason he would give a list. The problem is he doesn't give a list, even though you see all this pressure, if you will, from the canonical interpretation to see him as giving a list when he actually doesn't. He never identifies a single individual book, which is very odd if indeed he wants to segregate 22 books as being uniquely inspired. Okay, so, and by the way, I think there's also another problem too, and we spoke about that. Since he doesn't clearly identify which books are in the 22, there's disagreement in academia as to which books he does include in what order. For example, there is a sizable number of scholars who believe that Josephus omits a proto-canonical book, most likely Ecclesiastes, or perhaps Song of Songs. And I think Eusebius picks up on this. He must have, as he's quoting Josephus, tried to figure out what are the 22 and realize he's missing a book. And I think that's why Eusebius originally describes Josephus as giving the undisputed books of the Hebrews, which is an odd qualifier if he's just giving a canonical list, right? So I think Eusebius knew that there's a book missing, so probably these 22 are the ones that are undisputed amongst the Jews, which actually changes a lot in terms of what exactly Josephus is giving us with the 22 books. Okay, now let's move on to today's topic, and that is, does Josephus subdivide the 22 books in any discernible biblical division? In other words, there's common ways in which Jews and Christians subdivide the Old Testament, and if Josephus is given those subdivisions, then that would lend credence to him giving us a description of the Bible or the contents of the Bible. Okay, it doesn't prove it, but it would point in that direction. And if he doesn't use divisions, that should be another warning flag that perhaps there's something else going on here in Josephus rather than him giving a quote unquote canonical list. And by the way, if I ever slip up and describe him as a list or a canon, please just do the air quotes, because that's going to get tiring really quick if I keep doing that. Okay, so what are the common biblical subdivisions for the Old Testament? Okay, the most common division is the one I think most people are familiar with, especially Christians. It's the bipartite division of Scripture. In other words, the twofold division of the law and the prophets. That started actually before the time of Christ. We see its usage in the Maccabean period, and it's the predominant way the Old Testament is subdivided in the New Testament. You always hear about the law and the prophets when referring to the totality of the Scriptures. Now, there's other ways too. Sometimes the whole of the Scripture is described as the law. Sometimes the whole of the scripture described as prophets, perhaps. But law and the prophets, the bipartite division, I think, is predominant. Okay. And of course, this makes a distinction between the first 5 books of Moses, the Torah, and everything else afterwards. That's how it fits into the subdivision. Next subdivision is one that is associated with the Rabbinic Bible. Rabbis commonly divide the Old Testament into 3 parts, or a tripartite division of the law, the prophets, and the writings. There's some disagreement as to when the tripartite division started. For example, back around 200 BC, the book of Sirach, the Deuterocanonical book of Sirach, seems to, in its introduction, divide the sacred text into 3 parts. In fact, he does it even 3 times. He divides into 3 parts. And here they are right here. He says the law, the prophets, and the later authors. The law, the prophets, and the rest of the books of our ancestors. And then finally, the law itself, the prophets, and the rest of the books. So 3 times he speaks of scripture as a whole. He does seem to divide into 3 sections, but notice, unlike the first 2 sections, which he consistently identifies as the law and the prophets, the 3rd section isn't titled. It hasn't quite got to the point where there's a name for this category of books after the law and the prophets. And I think that's significant. Again, this is roughly about 200 BC, thereabouts, that you have the beginning of a 3-fold division, but that 3rd division has not yet become standardized so that there's actually a name for it or a title. Now, many people believe that Jesus actually gives a tripartite division in the Gospels. In Luke 24:22, for example, he says, "These are my words which I have spoken to you while I was still with you, that everything written of me in the law of Moses and in the prophets and Psalms must be fulfilled." And so people look at that and they say, see, Jesus himself gives a 3-fold tripartite division, the law, the prophets, and the writings. Well, the difficulty with that is what Jesus actually says. He doesn't say the law, the prophets, and the writings. He says the law of Moses and in the prophets and Psalms. The word writings is kind of injected in replacing the word Psalms. And there's lots of difficulties with that. We actually go in detail on a video here we've done a while ago. So if you're interested in taking a close look at Luke 24:22, we have an episode dedicated to that, and you can go through all the difficulties with it. Personally, I believe it's a bipartite division in which the Psalms are highlighted. In other words, it's the law of Moses and in the prophets, and especially the Psalms would be the way I would understand it. He doesn't use the term writings, so, be that as it may. The first undisputed use of the law, the prophets, and the writings is within rabbinic literature, which can be dated roughly at the very end of the 1st century to the beginning of the 2nd Christian century. So it is post-Christian, and it's rabbinic, and fairly rather late. Okay, so that's the tripartite division. And there are other divisions as well, probably things that you probably aren't familiar with. For example, there is a Greek translation of the Old Testament that's pre-Christian. It's known as the Septuagint. So this is a Jewish translation of the Old Testament into Greek. And the Septuagint has the subdivisions of the law, the history, poetry, and prophets. So it actually has a 4-fold division, and there's other divisions as well. I've already mentioned a few. So the question then, since these are standard biblical divisions, does Josephus employ that in Against Appian? Well, let's see what Josephus says. So here is Against Appian, Book 1, sections 39-40, so the pertinent sections. This is his enumeration. I get this, by the way, from Barclay translation, which is based on the best critical text, and I think a very faithful English translation. And this is what Josephus says. He says, 5 of these are the books of Moses, which contain both the laws and the tradition from the birth of humanity up to his death. This is a period of a little less than 3,000 years. From the death of Moses until Artaxerxes, king of the Persians after Xerxes, the prophets after Moses wrote a history of what took place in their own time in 13 books. The remaining 4 books contain hymns to God and instructions for people on life. Okay, so as you can see, he doesn't make very explicit any kind of division here. But that doesn't mean we can't discern some sort of division. In fact, you can read them into Josephus in pretty much any way you want. For example, you can see a bipartite division in this section simply by separating 39 from 40. So you have the 5 books of Moses, that would be the law, and then the prophets and the other books, remaining books as the prophets. That's how you can get a bipartite division. You can even get a tripartite division if you divide it as follows. In 39, that's the law. In 40, at the beginning of 40, you have the prophets. And then the 4 remaining books, the hymns to God and the instructions, are the writings. So you have the law, the prophets, and the writings there. But you also have genres as well. You could divide it that way and have him divide scripture into the law, history, prophets, hymns, and instructions. So you can actually have a 5 division. So the question is, does he give a division? I don't think you can see any kind of explicit division in here. But for the sake of argument, let's look at the tripartite division, because it's often argued that if there's a tripartite division, then that means the contents are identical to the rabbinic Bible, okay, the rabbinic counting. And so this is kind of the preferred way to read Josephus, as him giving a tripartite division. Now, this is possible, just like the bipartite and all the other different divisions. You could read that into the text. But does it hold water? Well, I'm going to follow Steve Mason, who is one of the top Josephine scholars out there. And we're going to go through this and see, can we discern really that he's giving an undoubted tripartite division? Okay, well, let's look at probably the clearest of the 3, which should be the law, the first division. Josephus in 39 says, 5 of these books are the books of Moses, which contain the laws and the tradition from the birth of humanity up to his death, period a little less than 3,000 years. Okay. Notice that he doesn't say the books of Moses, which contain the law. That would be the Torah, and that would be a clear-cut first part of the tripartite division. Instead, what Josephus actually says is he takes the books of Moses and then he subdivides them further. So he explains the contents of the 5 books as containing the laws. Notice it's plural, the laws, not the law. And the tradition, I guess you could probably, instead of tradition, just have history from birth of humanity till the death of Moses. So even here, it's not clear at all that Josephus is giving us the Torah, the law, the first of the 3 in a tripartite division. It's quite frankly, it just doesn't fall into that category because he distinguishes the contents of the 5 books of Moses. And like I said, I'm following Steve Mason on this. Steve Mason writes, quote, Moses' laws, as we have seen, do not constitute a division in Josephus's Bible. They represent only one kind of composition by Moses. So this is not the category of the law. The same thing's true for the prophets, by the way. Josephus is not distinguishing what we would call the prophets. Why? Well, because just a little bit earlier in Against Appian 137. According to him, all the books are written by prophets. For example, he says in 137, but the prophets alone learned by inspiration from God what happened in the distant past and most ancient past, and recorded plainly the events that took place in their own time just as they occurred. So there's really no distinction between the books of Moses and the 13 books of the prophets afterwards, other than the time and other than the laws. So that's important, right? Because it's not a clear-cut division of what we would call the prophets. And for the pagan reader, now this is important. Remember, Against Appian, the intended audience is not a Jewish audience, and certainly not a Christian audience. The intended audience is Gentile, Roman, okay? Would the Romans know or even care about a division of the prophets? No, that would not make sense. And in fact, given that Josephus already said that the prophets alone had written by inspiration about the ancient past and recorded plainly in their own times, to distinguish the 13 books as the prophets as opposed to the books of Moses, who is also a prophet, doesn't really make sense. In fact, it's very confusing for a Gentile audience. And again, Steve Mason says, quote, rather, this designation is consistent with his claim in Against Appian 137, like we just said, that all of the record writers were prophets. Moses, too, was a prophet without equal. There is no division of prophets implied in the biblical paraphrase. So this is not speaking about the category of the prophets. And I concur with Mason. I think that's absolutely right. And then you have the 4 remaining books. The 4 remaining books is difficult because, first, there aren't 4 remaining books in the category of the writings. The only way you can come up with 4 is if you combine a lot of different books. And that involves a lot of guesswork. And it doesn't seem like Josephus really cares to distinguish which of these 4 books they are. So they don't match any of the computations of the writings. And especially if you try to fit in his description as hymns and instructions, it doesn't fit all the remaining books. And that's why some scholars believe that Josephus is actually missing at least 1 book. After all of this, Mason concludes, now this is Steve Mason, it's not me. Quote, Josephus's remarks in Against Appian 137 through 43 cannot be made to specify divisions within the first century canon. His language is on a different plane. His most consistent ordering criteria is that of genre, laws, tradition, hymns, and advice. These genres do not correlate to the divisions of the Bible. They simply provide a means of elaborating for Gentile readers the various kinds of material that can be found among the 22 volumes. And I think Dr. Mason hits the nail on the head. I think that's exactly what's going on here, is that Josephus isn't giving us any biblical subdivisions, at least no known subdivisions. If anything, he's speaking in terms of the types of books that are there. And again, the biblical subdivisions, if it is somehow worked within the Josephine text, wouldn't make any sense to his Gentile readers. But if he explains what kind of books are found within the 22, that would make sense to the Gentile readers. And I think that's exactly what he does. So the windup is ultimately that the 22 books, if it's giving us a canonical list, doesn't present the 22 in a canonical form or even a biblical form, to tell you the truth. So that is very interesting. So we're going to stop right there. When we come back next time, we're going to take a slightly different approach to the canonical interpretation and further dismantle it. So if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, leave some comments. That helps with our visibility. We love comments. Also, if you want, you can support William Albrecht and myself on Patreon. Your support enables us to buy expensive books and other research material to do these videos. So we truly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Gary Machuda. Have a great week.